My name is Lauren Park, and for as long as I can remember, I've lived in the quiet spaces between other people's conversations. If you saw a family photo, you might miss me entirely. Maybe just a blur in the background, a hand holding a plate, a smile that never quite reached my eyes. Growing up as the oldest daughter in an immigrant family, I learned early that some victories go unnoticed. Even after building a tech company from scratch, after every late-night pitch and every obstacle conquered, I never quite escaped that old familiar feeling, invisibility. There's a certain ache in being present for every celebration, every crisis, and yet never being the center of anyone's story. I remember birthdays with leftover cake and holidays where my seat was always set at the very end of the table. My younger brother Eric was the golden child, his name echoed at graduations, his laughter filling every room. Meanwhile, I chased recognition in quiet ways. Honor roll certificates tucked in drawers, scholarships earned news clippings, folded carefully into boxes no one else ever opened. Maybe you know what it's like to be the dependable one, the strong one, the one no one worries about until you're gone. Sometimes I wondered if achieving more, working harder, earning bigger, might finally make them see me. I told myself every new milestone would be the one that changed everything. But with every call home, the same questions echoed. How's Eric? Did you hear about your brother's new promotion? My own news hung in the air, waiting for a space that never opened. I told myself it didn't matter, that independence was its own reward. But late at night, I felt the sting of longing, the hope for one simple thing: to belong. That's why when my brother's wedding invitation arrived, I let it sit unopened for days on the kitchen counter. Heavy cardstock embossed in gold, the kind that promises a storybook day. I stared at my name printed just below and guessed, and I felt old wounds prickling beneath my skin. Part of me still hoped that this event, this grand gathering, might finally prove I mattered to them. Part of me still wanted to believe that family could change. If you've ever felt unseen or overlooked, if you've ever wondered how many victories it takes before someone finally says, "I'm proud of you," I hope you'll stay with me for this story. Because what happened next at that wedding didn't just change my relationship with my family, it changed the way I saw myself. This isn't just a story about a seat at a wedding table. It's about finding your voice in the silence, choosing self-respect when approval never comes, and building a place where you belong even if you have to build it all by yourself. If you've ever felt like the invisible one, know that you're not alone. And maybe it's time we all stopped waiting for a seat at someone else's table and started building our own. Before we dive in, I want to thank you for being here. Stories like this are only possible because of people who listen, who share, comment, and help these conversations reach those who need them most. If you find a piece of your own story in mine, I hope you'll share it below. Now let's begin. Success, I learned, doesn't always feel the way you imagine. When I earned my scholarship to Stanford, it should have been a cause for celebration. Instead, the house buzzed with talk of Eric's latest soccer tournament. I remember standing in the kitchen, acceptance letter in hand, waiting for someone to ask about my news. Instead, my mom hurried past, reminding me to check on dinner, and my dad chuckled from the living room. "Eric's game is on tonight, don't forget to cheer him on." It was as if my victories were just passing clouds, and Eric's were the sunshine everyone gathered beneath. It's easy to think that if you just work harder, stay later, earn more, never complain, someone will eventually notice. But the truth is, sometimes achievement becomes invisible when it's expected of you. I pushed myself to graduate at the top of my class, to build a startup in a city where few looked like me, to close deals in rooms where my handshake was the only one not met with a pat on the back. At every milestone, I'd send a group text home. "We landed a new investor today." Replies were polite but brief, as if they came from acquaintances, not family. I started to notice a pattern not just in my family but in so many others I met through work. It's a quiet rule in some households: praises loud for the child who struggles, but muted for the one who's always fine. I once met another founder, Anna, a quiet powerhouse, who confided that her biggest deal earned a "that's nice, dear," while her brother's first job out of college prompted a full family dinner. We laughed about it, but underneath was something heavier. A shared ache of being the sturdy bridge everyone walks across, but no one stops to admire. Over time, I realized that chasing recognition from people determined not to see you is like trying to fill a cup with a hole at the bottom. No matter how much you pour in, it's never enough. That's not to say ambition is bad or that family never matters. But I had to learn the hard way that my self-worth couldn't hinge on applause that might never come. If you're nodding along, maybe you've been there too, the quiet child, the dependable sibling, the one whose tears dry unseen. The lesson, I think, is that value doesn't always come stamped with someone else's approval. Real success, I've come to believe, is being proud of yourself, even when no one else claps. It's a hard lesson, and one I'm still learning, but it makes every small victory sweeter when it comes from within. And while that ache of longing never fully disappears, it softens with time, especially as you build a world where your light isn't dimmed to make space for anyone else's. Still, there's something about family that keeps hope alive, even after years of disappointment. So when that wedding invitation arrived, all those old feelings resurfaced: hope, fear, and the fragile belief that maybe this time things could be different. That's the thing about longing for a seat at the table. Even after building your own, part of you still wonders what it would feel like to be welcomed just once, without question. And so as I slid that envelope onto the kitchen counter, I felt the first tremor of a story I'd been waiting my whole life to tell. The wedding invitation sat on my counter for days, unopened and heavy in its silence. I kept glancing at it while brewing coffee or making a late dinner, each time thinking, maybe tomorrow. There was no handwritten note inside, no doodle or private joke, like in birthday cards from years ago. It was just my name typed out and paired with, and guessed, as if I might bring a stranger who'd feel more at home than I did. That detail stung more than I expected. Sometimes the little things, like a missing personal touch, make the biggest difference in how loved we feel. I thought about all the other invitations I'd received over the years: birthday parties for Eric, graduation ceremonies for cousins, holiday gatherings that doubled as family reunions. My presence was always assumed, but never particularly requested. It's strange how absence can feel louder than rejection. Even after moving across the country, I still hoped each card in the mail might carry something that said, "We're proud of you, Lauren." But hope can be its own kind of weight, especially when it comes to family. The invitation wasn't cold, just distant, a formality sent to an address, not a heart. Deciding whether or not to go wasn't just about a party. It was about every time I'd convinced myself things might finally be different. Every conversation where I held my breath, hoping for the words I needed to hear. I remembered my friend Maya's advice once when she faced something similar with her own family. "Go if it's for you, not for them," she told me gently. "Let your presence be a gift to yourself, not another test you have to pass." That perspective changed everything. Suddenly, attending wasn't about earning approval, but about honoring the part of me that still cared. I stared at the RSVP card for a long time, weighing the possibilities. If I declined, would anyone even notice? If I went, could I handle another evening of polite conversation and invisible glances? The truth is, most of us carry old wounds into new rooms, hoping the setting will somehow change the story. I wondered if I could finally show up not as the girl craving validation, but as the woman I'd become. Sometimes choosing to participate is itself an act of courage, even if the outcome remains uncertain. It's okay to want more from the people we love, but it's also okay to draw boundaries when love feels conditional. So I circled accepts with pleasure and set the card aside, feeling a quiet kind of resolve settle over me. It was a decision to face the past with open eyes, to give myself permission to hope again, even if just a little. The lesson I realized is that we're allowed to revisit old stories, but we're not required to live in them forever. I wasn't sure what the wedding would bring, but I knew I'd finally stopped waiting for someone else to make the first move. With the RSVP dropped in the mailbox and my heart both heavy and light, I turned my attention back to work, letting the rhythm of busy days carry me forward. But every so often, I'd find my thoughts drifting back to the invitation, wondering what it would feel like to truly belong. And as the date drew nearer, I could sense that this time I'd be stepping into the story as myself, not just as someone else's supporting role, but as the author of my own next chapter. The night before the wedding, sleep was an impossible promise. I lay in bed watching city lights flicker through my curtains, replaying old conversations and unfinished arguments in my mind. Sometimes the anticipation of an event is more powerful than the event itself. I found myself rehearsing what I might say to my parents, or how I'd greet Eric after so long apart. It's amazing how even as adults we can become teenagers again in the presence of family. Every old insecurity crept up, whispering doubts and stoking fears I thought I'd already outgrown. In the quiet, I remembered how I used to call my friend Maya when nerves got the best of me. That night, she picked up on the second ring, her voice as warm and grounding as ever. I told her about the invitation, about my decision to go, and the tangled knot of hope and dread in my chest. "It's normal to feel anxious," she said softly. "You're walking into a place that made you but also hurt you. Just remember, you're not there to prove anything." Her words calmed me. Sometimes all we need is someone to remind us who we really are, apart from old roles and expectations. As I lay there, I also thought about the last time I'd gone home for a family holiday. There'd been a moment when I'd tried to share an exciting update about my company, a new partnership that would change everything for us. My mother smiled politely, but the conversation quickly turned to Eric's new house, his new car, his wedding plans. The sting of being overlooked lingered long after I'd returned to Portland. Realizing this, I understood that showing up at the wedding wouldn't erase those hurts, but maybe it would help me find closure. The lesson, I think, is that courage doesn't always mean charging ahead without fear. Sometimes it means choosing to show up even when you're afraid of being let down. We all want to be welcomed, celebrated, and seen, but sometimes the bravest thing we can do is go anyway, knowing we may have to celebrate ourselves. That night, I promised myself that I would go as Lauren, the woman who built her own life, not the girl forever waiting for an invitation to the family spotlight. As dawn broke, painting the sky in soft peach and gold, I finally drifted off for a few hours of restless sleep. When I woke, I felt a quiet strength in my chest, a resolve to face the day, not for anyone else's approval, but for my own peace of mind. It's funny how much power there is in a simple decision to show up for yourself. I started getting ready, choosing a dress that made me feel confident, not invisible. That small act set the tone for what would become one of the most important days of my life. Walking out the door, suitcase in hand, I took a deep breath and stepped into the morning. I reminded myself that this journey was no longer about proving my worth to people who couldn't see it. Instead, it was about honoring the person I'd become and trusting that whatever happened next, I could handle it. The city was waking up around me, and so was I, ready at last to write my own story. Little did I know, the next 24 hours would test every lesson I'd ever learned about family boundaries and the quiet strength it takes to finally be seen. Arriving at the wedding felt like stepping into a different world, one polished to a shine for the sake of appearances. The venue was beautiful, sunlight scattering through glass windows onto crisp white linens and carefully arranged flowers. I noticed how easily people slipped into their assigned roles. The proud parents, the boisterous cousins Eric and his fiancée, glowing in the center of it all. My own footsteps felt quieter somehow, as if I'd entered a play where everyone else already knew their lines. It's strange how certain places can make you feel both invited and excluded at the same time. When I reached the reception hall, a young planner greeted me with a practiced smile and scanned her chart for my name. Lauren Park. And guess she read aloud, glancing around as if I might be followed by someone more significant. She led me past clusters of laughter and hugs, down a side aisle to a table tucked against a wall near the swinging doors to the kitchen. There in a corner, half hidden by a giant floral arrangement, I found my seat. At that moment, all the resolve I'd built up threatened to crumble. Being on the guest list isn't the same as truly belonging. It reminded me of so many other gatherings, times when I'd offered to help hoping someone would notice the effort, but instead found myself refilling water pitchers or clearing plates while everyone else lingered at the heart of the celebration. Once at a family barbecue, I spent hours on the grill so my brother could mingle. At the end of the day, no one thanked me. They just assumed things would always run smoothly, never stopping to see who was behind the scenes. Small slights can leave lasting marks, especially when they echo old wounds. The lesson I keep learning is that proximity does not equal connection. You can be in the same room, the same photograph, even the same family, and still feel miles away from the warmth at the center. Some seats are set out of obligation, not out of love or recognition. I realized that my place at the table didn't reflect my value. It was simply the one they'd decided I should occupy. In that moment, I promised myself I wouldn't let the location of my chair determine my self-worth anymore. Still, as I sat there watching the party swirl around me, I found a quiet strength rising up. I noticed a few other guests in out-of-the-way spots, a distant aunt, a shy cousin, a neighbor who seemed relieved to see a familiar face. I smiled at them, understanding a little of their experience. Sometimes we connect not at the center of the crowd, but at the edges where people see each other more honestly. And so instead of retreating inward, I decided to offer kindness where I could. It was a small rebellion, and it changed the energy of the whole table. As the music started and the night unfolded, I realized this day would test more than my patience. It would challenge my definition of family and belonging. I knew the story wasn't over and that real transformation often begins at the margins. Little did I know the events to come would demand not just quiet endurance, but an act of courage that would redefine my place not only at this wedding, but in my own life. There's a moment at every family event when the masks slip just a little and the truth peeks through. For me, it happened as I watched my mother drifting from table to table, her laughter a little louder when she reached Eric or his new in-laws. When she finally made her way to my corner, she gave me a quick, polite hug and said, "I hope the table's all right, Lauren. It's just that we had to make room for important guests up front." Her words were meant to soothe, but they landed like stones. Sometimes the deepest cuts come dressed as courtesy. As the evening went on, I overheard snippets of conversation stories about Eric's latest promotion, how wonderful his fiancée was at organizing the seating chart, the pride in my parents' voices when they spoke of the future of the family. No one mentioned my company or asked about my life. It was as if the work I'd poured my soul into, the risks and victories, simply didn't fit the narrative of the night. I caught my own reflection in a window and wondered not for the first time how much of myself I'd left behind trying to fit into someone else's story. I remembered a dinner years ago, not long after I'd landed my first big contract. I brought news I thought would finally make them see me. Instead, the conversation shifted to Eric's plans for graduate school, and my announcement faded into the background noise of family chatter. That pattern repeated itself so many times that I began to doubt whether any achievement would ever be enough. In moments like these, you start to realize the difference between being present and being truly seen. It's a hard lesson, but a necessary one for anyone searching for their place. What I've learned is this: it's not selfish to want recognition, but it is damaging to build your sense of self around it. Families, like all groups, develop roles and expectations that are hard to break. The invisible ones often become peacemakers, helpers, the reliable background to everyone else's drama. If you find yourself always filling that role, it's easy to lose sight of your own dreams and desires. Stepping out of that script requires courage and a willingness to disappoint people who benefit from your silence. That night, I felt a quiet shift inside myself. I was done performing the part I'd been assigned. By dessert, my resolve had crystallized. I watched Eric stand to thank everyone, his speech full of warmth and gratitude, and I applauded with everyone else. But inside, I made a decision. I wouldn't let this night pass without honoring my own truth. The lesson was clear. Belonging that demands your silence is not belonging at all. I realized that if I wanted a different story, I'd have to start telling it myself. Little did I know before the night was over, I'd be forced to prove it publicly and with more bravery than I thought I had. After the cake was cut and the music faded into a softer hum, something inside me shifted from quiet acceptance to steady resolve. I realized that for years I had sat quietly on the sidelines of my own story, watching others celebrate, while I minimized my light for the sake of harmony. But that night, with laughter echoing and glasses clinking around me, I decided enough was enough. Sometimes the hardest boundaries to set are the ones that risk misunderstanding. But I finally understood that I couldn't wait for anyone else to acknowledge my worth. I had to do it for myself. The moment to act came unexpectedly. Eric's father-in-law was discussing future business partnerships at the head table, praising the family's network and recent successes. He referenced my company's technology, not knowing I was the founder, while my own parents smiled along, never correcting him. My cheeks burned, but I knew silence would cost me more than speaking up. So I stood, walked over, and voice steady introduced myself as the woman behind the innovation they'd been praising. For a moment, the entire table fell quiet. The surprise in their eyes was both painful and, in a strange way, freeing. It wasn't the dramatic confrontation some might imagine, no shouting, no slam doors. Instead, it was a calm reclaiming of my narrative, right there in the midst of family and strangers. I explained the vision behind my work, the risks I'd taken, and the purpose that had driven me all those years. Some nodded in approval, others looked away, but I felt an unfamiliar ease in my chest. For the first time, I hadn't shrunk myself to fit a role someone else had written. Sometimes courage is less about defiance and more about choosing visibility on your own terms. There's a lesson in moments like these. When we step forward even quietly, we change the story. Not just for ourselves but for others watching from the shadows. Later, a distant cousin approached and thanked me, admitting she'd always admired my tenacity, but had never seen anyone in the family openly challenge old patterns. It made me wonder how many others in their own ways were longing for permission to do the same. Authenticity has a ripple effect, and sometimes our bravery is the invitation others need to step into their own light. As I returned to my seat, I felt lighter, almost buoyant despite whatever awkwardness lingered. I didn't know what would happen next or how my family would react in the long run. But I did know this: I had claimed my seat not just at a wedding table, but in my own life. That quiet, courageous moment was only the beginning. The true test would come in the days that followed, as the stories we tell about ourselves collide with the expectations others have always held. I was finally ready for whatever came next. The aftermath of that evening rippled into the next day and beyond. At first, it was just a few curious glances and quiet messages, some from family members who had never reached out before, others from colleagues and old friends who'd heard about my stand. My phone lit up with a text from a cousin in Chicago. "I heard what you did last night. I wish I'd had your courage at our last family reunion." That one message made me realize how our choices, even the quiet ones, can give others permission to speak up for themselves. Sometimes just being visible is an act of service. There were also harder moments: awkward silences at breakfast, a cold politeness from certain relatives who felt I'd upset the order of things. My parents especially struggled to make sense of it all. My mother avoided direct conversation, busying herself in the kitchen, while my father suggested perhaps next time I should be more discreet. The pressure to smooth things over, to apologize for simply existing as myself, was strong. But I remembered the promise I'd made not to minimize myself, just to keep others comfortable. Growth is often uncomfortable, and sometimes families resist what they don't understand. Work was a surprising source of comfort. At my office, my team celebrated my bravery in ways my family never had. Maya brought in pastries and said to the boss, who reminds us all what showing up really looks like. Later that week, a junior engineer stopped by my desk, quietly admitting she'd never seen a woman in leadership take up space so unapologetically. I realized in that moment how much representation matters. When one person stands up, it often makes it safer for others to follow, whether in a conference room or at a family table. The lesson from these days is clear. Authenticity is contagious, but so is silence. If we keep hiding our achievements, our boundaries, our voices, we teach those around us to do the same. It's not about demanding the spotlight, but about refusing to hide in the shadows. By honoring my own truth, I found new respect not just from others, but from myself. If you're ever torn between comfort and honesty, remember that real connection only grows where there's room for everyone to show up as they truly are. Even as I found more strength at work and among supportive friends, the tension at home didn't dissolve overnight. Change is slow, and some wounds take time to heal. But I no longer felt powerless in those rooms. Instead, I saw possibility, a path forward, not just for me, but for anyone who has ever felt small at their own family's table. The next conversation I knew would be with Eric himself. Old rivalries and hidden fears needed to be brought into the light, and I was finally ready to meet them head-on. A few days after the wedding, Eric called and asked if we could meet for coffee. There was a hesitance in his voice I hadn't heard since we were kids, before life grew complicated with expectations and pride. We sat at a small table near the window of an old neighborhood cafe, the kind we'd visited together long ago. At first, conversation stumbled around safe topics: the weather, work, how tired we both looked. But eventually, silence settled between us. I realized we'd reached the crossroads where honesty could heal, or we could choose the old familiar route of pretending everything was fine. Eric was the first to break. He admitted he'd felt invisible too, just in a different way. "You always seemed so self-assured, Lauren. Like you didn't need anyone," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the swirling foam in his mug. For years, he'd been weighed down by the expectation to be the golden child, to always win, never falter. He confessed how much pressure he felt to make our parents proud, so much that sometimes he envied my independence. Hearing him share his burdens softened something in me. It reminded me that comparison steals joy from everyone it touches. We talked for hours, shedding old stories and letting our true feelings come out. I told Eric about the ache of never being celebrated, about the exhaustion of shrinking myself to keep the peace. He listened, really listened for the first time in years. In return, he shared his fears of failure and the loneliness that came with always being in the spotlight. We realized how much misunderstanding had grown in the spaces where we never dared to speak honestly. Our rivalry had only ever been a mask for the longing to be seen and loved just as we are. The lesson in that cafe was clear. No one escapes family dynamics unscathed, and we each carry invisible wounds. Sometimes the roles assigned to us are too small for the people we're meant to become. The real work is breaking those patterns together with compassion instead of blame. As we left, Eric gave me a long, tight hug, and I felt a hope I hadn't allowed myself in years. Our relationship wouldn't be fixed overnight, but we'd taken the most important step. We'd begun to truly see each other beyond the expectations and old hurts. Walking home, I felt lighter, more at peace than I had in a long time. The world outside hadn't changed, but something inside me had shifted. The conversation with Eric proved that growth is possible, even in relationships that feel hopelessly tangled. I knew the next step was building a new kind of table, one where every part of myself and every story was welcome. As the week unfolded, I felt ready for that final chapter, a celebration not just of what I'd survived, but of who I'd finally become. In the weeks after that conversation with Eric, something gentle and persistent changed inside me. I found myself reflecting on how far I'd come from the invisible daughter at family gatherings to someone who could sit at her own table proud and unafraid. I began inviting people into my life who truly saw me hosting small dinners with friends and colleagues who valued honesty and laughter over perfection. In those rooms, I realized belonging isn't granted by old roles or traditions. It's built moment by moment through mutual respect, listening, and kindness. Sometimes family is found in the connections we choose, not just the ones we're given. Looking back, every chapter of this story holds a lesson. I learned that seeking validation from those unwilling or unable to give it can become a lifelong trap. True self-worth is forged in the quiet moments when we honor ourselves, even if no one else notices. By showing up, speaking honestly, and daring to take up space, I discovered that the courage to be visible is itself a form of love, not just for others, but for the person I am now. And when I stopped hiding, I inspired others, family, friends, even colleagues to claim their own stories too. Of course, the old wounds don't disappear overnight. There are still awkward moments, silences at family dinners, or memories that sting. But these days, they no longer define me. I am not just the roles my family wrote for me, nor the old scripts I once played so well. Instead, I am the author of my own journey, someone who builds bridges instead of walls, who forgives without forgetting, and who trusts that the best kind of belonging is rooted in truth. The table I built for myself is open to anyone willing to show up as they really are. So if you're reading this and see a part of yourself in my story, know that you're not alone. Maybe you've sat at the edge of someone else's celebration, wondering if you'd ever feel seen. Maybe you've spent years chasing approval, only to realize that your light doesn't need permission to shine. Let this be your invitation to step forward, claim your worth, and rewrite the rules for your own life. The courage you show may just be the spark someone else needs to do the same. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear about your own journey in the comments below. Please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this video so we can continue building a community where everyone's voice matters. Your story, your voice, and your presence truly make a difference. Thank you for being here. And remember, the best seat at any table is the one you build for yourself.